All right, so thank you all for joining us. The time is almost here. CES 2016. I think, and we have a really special guest here today in Shawn DuBravac, and he's the chief economist for the Consumer Technology Association, used to be called CEA. And what we want to talk about today is the top tech trends heading into 2016. There's no better springboard for new tech than CES, where you have more than 150,000 people expected, more than 3,000 exhibitors. It's really hard to know where to start. But at the top of your head, what do you think is maybe going to be the biggest trend at this year's CES?
It's like making me pick my favorite child. I mean, there's just so much going on. It's set to be the biggest show from a square footage space that we've ever seen at CES, and probably the biggest event ever in the country. I mean, it's phenomenal what's going to be there. Virtual reality, clearly a big trend to watch. What's happening in an automotive space and autonomous vehicles is still a growing area. Wearables is exploding.
Right.
Just the growth in that category alone is bigger than a lot of shows are.
Right.
So there's phenomenal growth happening all over the show floor.
So how about we start with virtual reality? We happen to have our resident expert here in Cherie Smith, and both of us have taken a look at the Gear VR, but Cherie has also done a really deep dive on a lot of the other devices that are coming out, and we want to pick your brain on where this is going.
Well, number one, I want to specify that he has officially called me his favorite child because I cover VR. Number one. But with the proliferation of the Gear VR and the rise of Oculus, and I'm assuming the Vive is going to come this year, do you think that this is the year for consumer-ready mainstream VR?
I think it's the year to start that. And it'll take a little while for that to really start to work into our everyday applications and it be our default environment for gaming or for any other experience. I think it's the year to start that, and then I think we'll roll from there. And I think it will be, I would argue we even started building some of that foundation this year. We saw the New York Times send out Google Cardboard to 1 million plus subscribers of their Sunday paper, so that's getting it on consumers' radar. And I think not only seeing the headgear start to ship in the first half of the year, but then later on seeing some of the accessories come along. We're seeing a tremendous amount of investment in content, so that whole ecosystem is building out. I think that's really important for that space.
Have you seen any interesting peripherals out yet? Like, I've seen a few. I've seen a cycle controller that lets you bike through your PlayStation VR, your Oculus. That's weird, but have you seen anything that's just like, okay, like get ready, folks?
I think you'll start to see some of those things at CES. I mean, I think you are starting to see some of those accessories that will tie into it, and I think it's going to fundamentally shift a lot of what we think about. So I think about like booking a cruise ship. Today we go online and we try to figure all of that out, but I think in the years to come that will be a virtual reality experience. You'll walk the deck, you'll go from the pool to the restaurant, you'll walk in the cabin to see how big the cabin is. So all of that could be incorporated into a virtual reality experience. I think they'll be much more immersive, but also much more realistic to what you're actually getting. I think you'll start to see that hotels do that, resorts do that. And so you'll see not only the gaming aspect of it, but a commercialization of the experience. And I think that will be key when that starts to show up.
Very cool. And I guess my last question for right now is, do you think it's going to be an even split between PC and mobile VR users?
I think over time, mobile is going to be the home for a lot of this. I think early on, certainly given the requirements to create a really robust VR experience, a lot of that will be showing up in PC environment. We're 2.5 years away from presumably the next game console environment. So you could even start to envision that the next iteration of the game console will be driven in part by, if not completely driven by, a VR experience. And you could, so I think that's something to watch for in the years to come as well.
So, yeah, well, I was just going to say, VR is just one type of wearable device that's out there, and it remains to be seen how many people want to be seen wearing a headset. I think it's a good thing that it's a private experience, but the wearable device market is much bigger than that. And there's a huge presence at CES for all different types of companies that are doing smartwatches and fitness devices and that sort of thing. Where do you see that going? We actually have a couple of people here in Mike Prospero and Sherlyn Lowe, and they cover it from different angles. Mike is all about the fitness. And Sherlyn has been covering a lot of the smartwatches. Where do you see the market going?
I think there's a tremendous amount of fragmentation right now because we're driving connectivity, ultimately the internet, into all of these different facets of our life. And I think that's the much bigger, broader kind of philosophical question is, where should the internet be? Where does it make sense to put the internet? And when we drive the internet to these places, what's the use case scenario? What's the user experience? So we still spend a lot of time talking about this smartwatch and what are the specs and what's the design look like. But more broadly, the question we're asking is, what does the internet mean when we put it on the wrist? And what type of experience are we empowering with that? And I think if you look at CES from that perspective of, does the internet make sense here? And if so, what's the use case scenario? Right. Then you start to see a broadening of applications.
Now, Sherlyn in particular, you've gotten some crazy pitches so far, the types of products that might be shown at CES.
People
what are some
strange.
of the...
So you're like, where should the internet go? Some people were like, inside my body, because there's this pitch I got. They're like, ingestible is the new wearable. That's literally the title of the pitch. And I'm like, so you eat something now, it's a pill, and it will monitor your body temperature. So like, does this make sense? And is this going to like take off? Because aren't there like people regulating things like this that are spending so much time inside or on your body? Like, do you guys pay attention to that before you let someone show at CES? Do you take into consideration those things?
Well, so CES is the stage for innovation. We're going to let anybody that qualifies come and show what they're bringing to market. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there is a lot of regulation around devices and applications, especially when certain claims are being made with regard to health or other metrics that are being captured. And I think you're seeing a lot of those lines blur, the blurring between what's a fitness device and then what's a medical device. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a landscape that we'll be navigating over the next couple of years. What is novel and unique, and then what essentially becomes core to what we do, who we are, our health, those type of things.
Well, do you think it's going to be a very niche audience because there is certain, wearables that are helping you monitor your blood sugar level for, I guess, diabetic people, and then there's people who want to just track their activity, or when they go skiing or something, they want to be able to. So, do they have to really fragment that way, or is there going to be like one wearable that's going to do it all?
I think you'll see that fragmentation. The closer to what you're measuring, the closer we can get sensors to what you're actually measuring, the better the data, the less noise you have in the data, the more accurate you have. So, I think actually over time, I think we'll start measuring certain things, running, steps, things like that, by things we're wearing around our ankles, things we're wearing on our shoes, because you're getting closer to where that data is actually being produced and captured. And so I think you will see these very niche, very well-defined applications where it's something that you're not going to wear every single day, but you are going to wear it when you do this activity. The Reebok Check Light is a great example. It launched at CES a couple years ago. It's something you wear inside a helmet that measures for hits that could produce a concussion. Mm-hmm. And so that's something you don't need to wear every day, but you will wear it when you're playing these contact sports. I think that's a big direction in wearables. And then I think another big direction is when you start to tie it into these other systems. So the kind of the view of the future that I see is that my autonomous vehicle will have access to my digital camera, to my digital calendar, and then it'll also have access to my wearables that are measuring my activity levels. It'll know my goals. So we tend today to think narrowly that our autonomous vehicle will drop us off right where we want to be dropped off. But it might be a much more dynamic experience where it says, hey, Shawn, we see that you've got a goal to walk 5,000 steps today. We're looking at your calendar, and we don't think you're going to hit that goal, so we're going to leave a little early, and we're going to drop you off 8 blocks from your appointment. And we're going to ensure that you hit these goals. And so start to take all of these different data sets collectively to paint a much more holistic picture of the individual.
I can see those arguments taking place with your car. No, I'm actually feeling lazy today.
That's right.
If it checks the weather, and it's raining outside, then maybe it'll stay in.
Right.
Mike, you actually got a couple of pitches for wearable or smart clothing and shoes and things like that, right?
Yeah. So I think, to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the trends we might see is, will wearables go beyond the wrist?
Definitely. Yeah, 100%. I think you're going to start to see wearables go beyond the wrist. And it really then speaks to these very well-defined use case scenarios. It's something that you're going to want to use when you're doing this particular activity. Maybe it's baseball, maybe it's tennis, so maybe it's a sport, maybe it's some ailment that you've got or that you're trying to monitor and measure. And so there's some segment of the population that is applicable to. And that's your addressable market. I think we so often think of addressable markets as 100%, every household, every individual, but it's not. In many of these cases, it'll be a much more niche application, and in those environments, moving beyond the wrist makes all the sense in the world.
Now, Sheree, from your perspective, I was just going to ask, you wear jewelry, but not tech on your wrist or anywhere else. What would change your mind?
I mean, I like classic looking things, so in terms of a watch, listen, in terms of a watch, I want it to look like a watch. I see that. It's cute.
This is a tech thing too.
Yeah, I know it is. It's cute. If I had to choose right now, I'd probably go with that Fossil watch that Mike reviewed. It looks like a watch, even though I'm not fond of that little band that Android Wear does on the bottom. But still, it looks very nice. And I wear headphones. That's my tech. That's my wearable
That's
tech.
your wearable.
It counts, right?
And there's a lot of things that people are doing with headphones too. Like some of them are biometric, some of them are for fitness. But I'm a fan of gorgeous wearables. I think that there's a split in the wearables industry, and correct me if I'm wrong, but some of them are really focusing on the stylish looks and stuff like that. And even the Fitbit can be dressed up, like we did that story. But it's really hard because some people, you just can't squeeze the right tech into a good-looking thing these days. Like, this just vibrates. I don't need a vibrating finger.
Well, so I think that's starting to change, and 2016 CS could be a key piece of that, because when we started the wearable movement, if you will, if we call it a movement, it was taking components that had gotten inexpensive because they were being deployed in billions of smartphones, and we started to put them into other form factors. Right. And so we were taking off-the-shelf products, essentially components, and putting them into these other form factors. And so we were limited by and restricted by what we already had available to us. But as economies to scale start to develop in the wearable space, then you really can start to focus on components that are designed for that in-use environment and can be designed to create a more beautiful look. So you can start to have the best of both worlds, something that looks great and also measures what you want it to measure.
But I think to a certain degree, like today's smartwatches are multi-purpose devices. They're almost like shrunken down smartphones, and maybe that's part of the reason why they haven't taken off, is because they don't have the focus of something like a fitness tracker. I mean, I don't know what you guys think, but maybe that's part of the issue, is like people don't know why they would replace their phone with something that is basically a shrunken down version of what they already have.
And I guess my other question too would be, with this increasing specialization of fitness and wearable devices, do you see a company like Fitbit losing its dominance in the marketplace?
So speaking to the first question, I think one of the things that happens with innovation broadly and technology specifically is that we take what we know and we try to apply it into new places. So when we took the internet from the PC, from the computing environment to the mobile phone environment, we integrated it in the way we understood the internet at that point, which was browser. And you think back to 05, 06, when we were driving into the smartphone era, it was all around the browser. There were browser wars. It was focused on the browser. Even the original iPhone commercials in 07 were, look at the internet, it's the full internet. It's look at browsing the internet on your phone. What we realized, and it would take another 9 or 10 months, was we want just bits of the internet. We want them delivered in a very quick, meaningful way, and so that introduced us to apps. Yep. Now as we take internet to other devices like the wrist or the watch, we're still taking with it in the way that we knew. So we say, hey, apps work really well on the phones, let's use apps in the watch. I would argue that may not be the right way to deliver the internet to the watch or to the wrist. And so we haven't yet fully discovered what's the right way to get the internet on the wrist.
It could be richer notifications.
Sure, it could be any number of different things. Yeah. Payments, I mean, there's been some exploration around payments from the wrist. So it could be that an app isn't the right way of delivering information and ultimately the internet to the wrist. It could be something totally different. And when we discover that, I think that's when you'll see it really take off. And then I think also integrating it into our everyday life. So when it becomes part of who we are, that's when we'll really start to say, hey, this is something I need. I think about the number of times I leave my house without my keys, without my wallet. I never leave my house without my smartphone.
Right.
It always comes with me. And so I just never forget it, and I think when other pieces of the tech world have that same type of hold on us, then we'll see it really start to accelerate.
Well, speaking of home, I mean, a lot of people are talking about the idea of a smart home, but up until now, it really seems like only a few types of devices have really resonated with consumers, mostly like the smart thermostats. Mike has actually done a roundup for us on that. The security cameras, which have other features that are a part of it. But I still think there's a lot of confusion around what a smart home is, what it's going to do for you. Is it worth paying extra for having all these devices being interconnected? What do you see for CES 2016 that might start to address some of those concerns?
I think this is the big push for CES in 2016 is the Internet of Things, connecting, digitizing, and then ultimately embedding sensors into more and more objects. So we really spent the last 10 or 15 years digitizing devices. We sold the first digital television in '98. We get the iPod in '01, first smartphone in '03, and so we slowly started replacing analog products with digital ones.
Right.
Now we're doing that with objects, whether it's clothing, whether it's other pieces of our everyday life. And so I think one of the things that's driving that is what was once expensive, some of these sensors, is now inexpensive, so we can deploy them widely. We can put cameras all over our house and we can have them do a number of different things. It isn't just necessarily seeing somebody's there or seeing what they're doing, but that information can then start to empower other things. So imagine I want my dishwasher to turn on when I'm not home. We can start to use these cameras to measure motion, start to use microphones to see if anybody's around, and then start to operate these other systems based upon whatever parameters I've set.
Can you get someone to load it though? That's the thing. Well, Mike, what are you seeing from your perspective? I think the smart home hub roundup that you did was really intriguing up until we got to the point where we realized that none of them actually made sense for consumers, and that, like, to your point, like the phone is really the hub. Is that
I think that's the way it's turning. But I think one of the issues that consumers have had so far, and I think it's still going on, is that, for the example you just provided, you have your dishwasher turn on when you're not at home because it senses it from some cameras. I think that interconnectedness is something that consumers still have yet to grasp. I can use this to do this and this and do this. So have you seen companies, how are companies trying to address that?
I think those are a lot of the pitches that I've been getting, headed into CES, is looking at that interconnectivity and trying to create really meaningful, robust use case scenarios that make sense. And I think you'll start to see an expansion of that. You've got all these great classic quotes, right? Of consumers not really knowing what they want until they see it, and that's probably a little bit of what's happening within that Internet of Things environment, and certainly within the smart home. And another key piece is the ability to adopt this technology is drastically different than it was 15 or 20 years ago. Right. If you wanted to have a smart connected home 15 or 20 years ago, you'd have to hire an installer, you'd have to cut drywall, you'd have to run cables. It was a pretty big task. Today you can do something as simple as take your 9-volt battery out of the smoke alarm, put in one that's now connected. We saw that launch last year at CES. And now all of a sudden, you can get an alert on your mobile phone that your house is burning down. You can get home in time to see it burn down. But we start to connect all of these devices, and that's something as simple as replacing the 9-volt battery.
I want something in an app that can turn off all my Christmas lights at once. There's like 100 around my house.
Or set it to like highway to hell. Just do that. That would be awesome.
Since we're on the subject of smart homes, obviously the centerpiece for most people's smart homes or homes in general when it comes to electronics is the TV.
Yeah.
Right? Now, the big trend, I guess last year was 4K. There'll probably continue to be the trend. People are starting to talk about HDR.
Sure.
what are you seeing, and what are the big trends for CES?
I mean, both of those things are going to be very big trends. Trends that we're seeing from consumers is still a gravitation towards connected, a gravitation towards 4K Ultra HD sets, up over 500% from a year ago period. So we're seeing phenomenal growth there. We expect it to almost double again next year. So you've got a lot of growth there. And then a continued gravitation towards larger screens. Probably no surprise to any of you that we want bigger, beautiful screens. I think HDR is a really interesting trend.
Right.
And I think you're going to get support from Hollywood because they'll feel like it's a more accurate capture of what they saw when they filmed the movie, or gave a much more useful, immersive experience, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, we've only reviewed one set so far with HDR capability built in. I believe it was a Sony, but the idea is better contrast, much more accurate colors. A lot of people are talking about a wider color gamut. One question I have, related to that though, is that for someone like Cherie, when you're at home and you're gaming, we have reviewed some 4K monitors. Some of them have not necessarily kept up in terms of the frame rates, but to get to that holy grail of a 4K set, like what's the tipping point for someone like you?
I need my content to match the 4K display. Right now, a lot of games are set at 1080p, and until it goes up to 4K, I don't feel the need to invest in a 4K TV. And even with the content that we have currently, just TV-wise, like Netflix is coming into doing 4K, and I know the Shields can stream 4K, but there's not a lot of 4K content that would make me, even as the price plummets down, invest in the TV yet. It's just not practically sound for me. But like early adopters, by all means, get a 4K TV.
That's a good question though, because are we going to see an expansion of the ecosystem for content at CES and beyond, whether it's the new Blu-ray spec or other things?
I think so. So clearly you're getting new Blu-ray specs, you're working around things that we tend to take for granted, right? Packaging. You want some consistency in what the Blu-ray discs look like and how to differentiate a Blu-ray disc from a 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray disc. So a lot of thought, planning have gone into that, and that's things we'll start to see in 2016. TV sets, 4K sets, half of what they were a year ago. The price continues to come down. Wasn't that long ago that these were only 84 inches and above. They were $25,000.
Right.
That was only 3 or 4 years ago. And so now, they're selling on average for about $1,100. You're starting to see manufacturers even phase out some of their 1080p sets over certain screen sizes. I think moving more fully towards 4K Ultra HD sets. I think all of that momentum is there as we enter into CES and then to 2016.
One of the categories that also has a ton of momentum right now is drones. And even if you take a look at our real-time traffic, Best Drones is consistently at the top, surprisingly so, beating out a lot of other categories. I know Sherlyn wouldn't mind probably hooking up some of the selfies, the selfie phones that you're testing right now
At
for
the
that.
last CES, you guys even showed a selfie-taking drone, and then it's called a Nixie. It's ungodly. And then there's one that we recently heard about that will detect your smile and follow you around.
Stalker cam.
Yeah, basically the dream product for stalkers. I love it. I mean, I would love having my personal paparazzi around.
For narcissists, I guess.
For narcissists like me. But I think that drones interest people. Like a lot of my friends were super interested in setting up their own drones, creating that camera, dock or something to just take that aerial footage because it's just so gorgeous.
Right.
To see you from up there.
So, but what's going to be new for 2016 then? And I'm also curious whether or not you think there might be a backlash or confusion among consumers about the fact that you will have to register your drone with the FAA if it's over a certain weight.
So I think there is massive confusion there, and there will be confusion for the consumers. And I think anytime there's a lack of clarity in public policy, that can stymie innovation, can stymie uptake of the technology. So I think that's something policymakers clearly need to be cautious of when they're looking at it, especially in a very new category like this. And so I think at CES you'll see a continued expansion of that drone category. We focus so much on aerial drones, but obviously You could see that the toy piece of it continuing to expand as we digitize other toys and incorporate controls and other things like that. So I think you'll see an expansion there. And in past CESs, we've had awesome introductions of new products and new devices that fit within that space broadly.
Yeah.
This is not a category that I see, at least initially, that's going to have massive uptake where 80% of households own them. It'll be something that's very attractive to a segment of the population, and they'll look at it. As you mentioned, the video footage is incredible. So you get just phenomenal video footage from it.
And it's good for Star Wars fans because we just reviewed the Millennium Falcon drone.
Yeah.
Just because we needed one more product that was tied in, to the movie franchise.
I like drones in the fact that they can be tied into VR. I have a few pitches that you'll have drones that you can use to create your own VR experience. So I'm really excited to see that. Verse, which is an app in the Oculus Store, actually has a demo where it puts you into the middle of an NYC protest, as well as watching the fireworks from underneath the Brooklyn Bridge, and you get this really good shot from the East River, and you look up and there's fireworks, and you look to the left of you, there's all these people, but you're kind of floating, and it's kind of weird, but it's still awesome.
Right. There's something about that weirdness that makes all of VR magical.
Yeah.
I get sick with, I'm one of those motion sickness sufferers that will never be able to enjoy VR, sadly enough.
Never say never. The technology is getting better.
That's what I hear.
Month after month, I just saw some software that's going to make the rendering a lot more efficient, so it'll cut down even more on the latency and maintain the 90 FPS rate needed to make sure that you don't catch nausea, or as I like to call it, the herk and jerk. But
so, I guess if self-driving cars become a reality, I guess we'll all be able to sit back and enjoy our VR experience while we're going down the road. We were talking a little bit earlier before we came on about 9 out of the major 10 automakers are going to be at CES.
That's right.
What are some of the things that they're going to be talking about?
I think everything is in flux in that. Obviously, autonomous vehicles, we're continuing to drive towards that. Many of the manufacturers are suggesting by 2020 we'll start to see those become available to consumers. And so we're not that far away from that. That's just right around the corner when you think about it. We'll be able to think about autonomous vehicles. Already the feature sets are starting to show up, and you see a lot of that in today's automotive experience, whether it's adaptive cruise control, lane assist, park assist. All of these features are now autonomous in many ways. So you'll see, I think, a continued focus on that. You'll see a continued focus on the broader connected car experience, and then that in-car experience fundamentally shifts when you start to have autonomous vehicles. You don't need to sit in seats. You don't need to, wear seat belts. Technically, you don't need to have a steering wheel. I mean, all of this, the interior of that vehicle can fundamentally change in an autonomous vehicle setting, and so all of that can be completely customized. And I think in years to come, you'll see a greater focus on that at CES.
How many people here would be willing to give up the actual driving part of driving?
I live in New York. I already know that.
I don't have a license. I will.
So we got 2 out of 4. Mike, what do you think?
There's still something to be said, for getting on the open road and just kicking back. Some people enjoy driving. Sometimes it isn't, sort of relaxing. Not in bumper traffic, mind you. But,
I have an old MG that I love to drive, so I would hate to have that ever become autonomous, because some of the beauty of it is that I feel like I'm in just a big go-kart. But
maybe it's like switching modes or something once it gets to that point.
Yeah, but for my daily commute, I'd have no problem sitting back and riding in that. And I think even the term driving might one day be an archaic term. I mean, I look at kids today, and I was with my sons a couple years ago, and they said, "Dad, why is it called rolling down the window?"
Make sure you tape My Favorite Show.
That's right. Tape My Favorite Show. So maybe, in 20, 30 years, they'll say, why do we call it driving a car? Why does, we'll have to explain that. One day we used to sit with the steering wheel between our lap, and we could actually control where it went.
In the future, they'll be tapping a car. So just
That's true. So maybe before we wrap up, it might be fun to hear from each of you. So let's say we're a week after CES. What do you think will be the biggest, news of the show or the biggest trend coming out of it? What do you guys think? Mike, why don't we start with you?
I think it would be something around wearables, something that's going to sort of revolutionize the way we think about our health and fitness, and how we interact with the technology that sort of records that.
Okay.
I think I'm going to find like that big ticket peripheral for VR that's ready and waiting for PlayStation VR or Oculus or the Vive. I know Virtuix and the Omni is finally coming to consumers. That's that big treadmill that you use for VR. You just pop the helmet on and you can run, and so that's going to be finally ready for consumers. So I'm expecting something like big ticket like that.
Cool. Sean, what do you think?
I mean, I think wearables and VR are prime suspects. I think Internet of Things broadly, I think we'll see some really interesting things that are now connected to the internet, and entirely new use case scenarios that emerge because of that. We see these things happen, but we don't necessarily realize it. You know, you look at when image sensors went from expensive to inexpensive, we included 2 on your mobile phone, 1 on the back and 1 on the front. And when we included 1 on the front, what happens? Right, we get selfies. And so the use case scenario for that device completely changed just because we put what had been an expensive, scarce sensor onto the front when it became inexpensive and more in abundance. So I think you'll see more of that, whether it's 360-degree cameras that will allow us to do our own VR experience. I mean, that is pretty phenomenal to think that we'll be able to, in 2016, record our own VR experiences. I think that is enabled because of the deployment of sensors. So that Internet of Things, deployment of sensors, empowering entirely new experiences will be, I think, what we'll look back on.
Okay, Shirley, what do you
To
think?
jump onto what you were saying, I was taking selfies before they added the second camera, so I'm way ahead of y'all. But I think it's a combination of the two, because my beats are smartphones and wearables. I really want to say that smartphones are going to do something different, but I don't think so anymore. Wearables are still so fragmented, but I feel like we're going to see such a big push in the medical grade stuff that like we talked about, that whole niche becoming more and more niche. Something's going to come out of there that's going to like change someone's life, not mine, but someone's. And then VR, I've gotten a lot of pitches about just, yes, like you said, putting the power of creating VR content into the consumer, because Google already came out with their cardboard camera app. So you can basically take VR, pictures with your Android phone already, and then now people are making cameras on phones that are supposed to do that with the better depth perception difference and stuff like that. I just think 2016 is the year for VR. That's I'm gonna call it.
Okay, well, you heard it here
20
first. For me, I think we're going to see less hoverboards for various reasons. And I actually agree with you guys. I think we're going to see a broadening of the VR ecosystem, whether it's stuff that we create, but I do think that there's this assumption that VR is all about gaming. And while there are some pretty mind-blowing experiences that we've been exposed to, I think it's going to change, if it's done right, it's going to change the way we learn, the way we experience things, all for the better. Yes, there's a geek factor, but maybe that erodes over time the more people are exposed to it.
Yeah, and I think to build off that, I mean, look at K through 12 education today. When I go back and I look at my math training, even geometry was two-dimensional. But today, kids are playing Minecraft, so they're manipulating three-dimensional space, or they're playing for shooter games, or they've got that depth perception is something that they're already accustomed to. They're 3D printing, they're doing and using virtual reality increasingly, and so their ability to maneuver and manage and manipulate three-dimensional space is much more natural to them. And so I think 10, 15 years when that cohort enters the workforce, it will have a very pronounced impact. They'll be saying, why are we going to do this in two-dimensional space? And they'll easily be able to push it into three-dimensional space.
Great. Well, I wanted to thank you, Shawn, for joining us.
It's great to be here.
Thank you to my fellow panelists. We'll be at CES 2016 in full force with Mike Prospero, Cherie Smith, and Sherlyn Lowe. I'm Mark Spoonhour with Tom's Guide, and stay tuned for all of our coverage at CES 2016.